We'll now recognize members for 5 minutes to ask questions, and I'll recognize myself for that purpose. There have been recent reports that local territorial disputes with China, in fact, have sharpened since Secretary of State Clinton's call for America's Pacific Century. Is it just a coincidence that these conflicts between China and Vietnam and China and the Philippines and China and Japan, et cetera, have intensified since the so-called pivot to Asia? Could China be operating under the impression that their neighbors have become emboldened by the protection offered by increased military cooperation with the United States, for example? And what other unstable dynamics, in addition to increasing tensions in the East and South China Seas, are likely to be generated in the near or distant future that could undermine our so-called Asia pivot? And I would welcome any of the members of the panel. Mr. Lohman?
I would actually say it's just the opposite. That is that the U.S. Attention to the region and attention to the complaints of our allies, in some cases, in the case of the Philippines, a treaty ally, is a response to the pressure that the Chinese are putting on our friends in the region. And that impetus is coming from within China. It's coming from a couple decades of patriotic education, things emphasizing their rights in those waters, a media environment there that only gives people the outlet to criticize the United States or criticize the Philippines or criticize Japan, but they allow them to sell newspapers. So how are they going to sell newspapers? They're going to criticize in the harshest possible terms. So there's a certain dynamic in China, I think, that is driving their claims and their aggressiveness in their near seas. And the U.S. is responding to those largely because our friends and allies are coming to us, asking us to help.
Mr. Nehru.
Let me add to Mr. Lohman's point. Actually, China's claims in the South China Sea have been in existence for a long time, certainly for several decades. But they have never really pursued these claims actively. But as their capabilities, especially naval capabilities, the fisheries regulator, the law enforcement commission, their capabilities of local governments, which are the coastal regions, and their Coast Guard capabilities have increased, they have gradually extended their enforcement out into the South China Sea, and that's led to some of these interactions. So I would agree with Mr. Lohman. I don't think it's necessarily the U.S. pivot. I would just like to add one more point, and that is the Vietnam issue really arose because of the passage of the Vietnam Maritime Law, which included some of the islands and the paracels as they were embodied in the law itself. And that, I think, created enormous concerns in China and created a reaction, because until that point, it had never been embodied in any Vietnamese law.
Thank you. Let me get my second question in, and then I'll address that to Mr. Dume and Mr. Pire. As a way to help India become more economically integrated within the region, should the U.S. support India's participation in the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, forum, and if so, why? And why has India not yet been invited? And how could APEC help India? And are there any risks that the U.S. Faces by inviting India to join? And if you wanted to comment at all on TPP, all of those things, and I've got 1 minute between the two of you to try to do it. So, Mr. Dume?
Well, I'll comment very briefly. Short answer is yes, the U.S. should support India's entry into APEC. I think the broader principle at work over here is that the U.S. should support greater Indian integration into political and economic institutions in Asia, and APEC is one of them. The reason that it hasn't been there is that India has not traditionally been seen as a Pacific power. It's an Indian Ocean power. But I think that's, those are just details. And the broader idea should be to include India in all these institutions. Similarly, the TPP, I think India is very far away from being in the TPP right now, but the principle behind the TPP, again, should be expansive, inclusive, and I believe that is the general idea behind it.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts on those things, Mr. Puri? Anything you'd like to add?
No, I think my colleagues did talk about it, and I think the United States should support India in terms of joining the APEC.
Okay, thank you very much. My time has expired. The gentleman from California, the ranking member today, is recognized for 5 minutes.